Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us here today. This session is one of the final breakouts we have for our conference, What's a Forest Worth? Forest Resources, Ecosystem Services, and Natural Capital. I'm glad you're able to join us today. I'll get to the speakers in a moment, just a little housekeeping. I'd like to recognize that we're on the traditional territory of the Sununemu First Nation, so thank you. In terms of safety, we have exits out that way, exits out this way. I won't be bringing a beverage cart around, but as well as I think everyone knows by now, we have Pigeonhole here. So as the session goes along, please enter your questions. Again, rank them, vote on them, and then we'll get to them towards the end. So we're very excited to be able to do this presentation today. I see today's presentation being in a really good timing spot. It kind of brings together, in my view, what we've been talking about and puts a bow around it in some respects. We've talked about old growth, there's been hydrology, wildfire, a lot of really important topics to our profession. And what we're doing today is presenting some ideas, maybe even some new terminology around ecosystem services, natural assets, and I think they're going to start to become part of our lexicon in forestry and forest management as we go forward. I was excited to hear one of the speakers in the old growth management session reference ecosystem services, so it was exciting to hear that already happening and building into what we're talking about here in the profession. So anyways, this is a little bit out of what's in the program, but I just thought it important to kind of touch on it a bit here too before we get started. We're going to be talking about traditional methods of forest valuation that typically focus on timber extraction and wood resource utilization in the form of saw logs, pulp logs, and biomass. But this session seeks to highlight alternative means for valuation of natural resources beyond those traditional methods. We're going to focus on economics, natural resources, with specific attention to those terms, ecosystem services, natural capital, natural assets. And that's going to be in the context of forest management and in terms of the working forest. So within BC, as we know, there's intense pressure for lots of forest management change. We're increasingly seeing communities wanting more of a say in how forestry is conducted in their backyard in relationship to where the communities are. And that's particularly related to watersheds. We heard Mayor Minions at the Mayor's plenary panel talking about that very issue. So it's timely. We're hearing more about preservation and a halt to logging. And with these mounting pressures on the land base, it means that we need to look at ways of objectively valuing those trade-offs. And that doesn't really happen in our traditional means of valuing forests and how we financially account for fiber and resource extraction today. So we need to understand those trade-offs. We need to find ways to value them in order to make reasonable and informed decisions. So today we're going to hear from our speakers, a host of active practitioners and economists, in order to help us understand what these terms mean and how we can bring them to play in our own activities and forest management things that we do. So I'm pleased to introduce the three speakers. I'm going to introduce them each ahead of what their time of speaking is. So our first speaker today is Dr. Vic Adamowicz. Vic is the Vice Dean of the Faculty of Agriculture, Life, and Environmental Sciences at the University of Alberta. He's a distinguished university professor also in the Department of Resource Economics and Environmental Sociology, Faculty of Agriculture, Life and Environmental Sciences, also at the University of Alberta. I won't put that into letters because we've already gone through that with the minister, but that is a mouthful. So he's got his Bachelor's of Science and Master's of Science also from the University of Alberta, and a PhD from the University of Minnesota in 1988. So Vic's research has focused on the economic valuation of environmental amenities, and ecosystem services, and the incorporation of environmental values into economic analysis, with specific applications to forestry, water quality, air quality, endangered species, and agriculture. His research also involves the analysis of choice behavior with applications to food demand, recreation, and environmental quality. So Vic certainly brings a wealth of research knowledge to our talk today. We appreciate that. So with that, Dr. Adamowicz, Vic, please, over to you. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I must admit I haven't come to this conference for about 10 years, so it's really impressive to see the size of the group and the venue, and here we go, we're gonna get my presentation loaded up. Let me go back to the beginning. There we go. Okay, there we go. Okay, so what's a forest worth is the title of the session. I'm not gonna answer that question. I'm gonna tell you little pieces of what it's worth. So my job is to go through some of the terminology and the concepts, and I hope the feedback isn't too bad on this microphone. And I'm gonna talk about a few examples, things that I've played with, and maybe some of the issues or concerns. So here's what I wanna do. I wanna talk about what is natural capital, what are ecosystem services. I know my colleagues are gonna show you some images and talk about real examples, so I get to do the very academic thing. I'm gonna give you graphs and equations and text. I teach a graduate course in this, in fact, right now, so I'm cramming it all into half an hour. So I hope you're ready. That's part of it. What's natural capital? What are ecosystem services? What good is this? What are we gonna benefit from by understanding the value of natural capital and the value of ecosystem services? I'm gonna put that into 3 boxes. One is a little bit abstract, it's measuring sustainability. You know, sustainability is this concept that people think is kind of vague. Well, as an economist, I have a fairly focused thought about sustainability. We'll see what you think about that one. Investment decisions. How do we use concepts of natural capital to help us decide whether we should invest in forests, in land, in other capital stocks? And I'm going to talk a little bit about markets for ecosystem services. I spent most of my career focusing on the value of things that are not in a market and how important those are to society. And often I present to audiences and they'll come back to me and say, this gets real when you show me the money. When you provide a market that actually transfers dollars to provide those services. So I want to talk a little bit about markets for ecosystem services. I'm going to talk about some case studies, mostly things that I've been involved in because I'm a bit more comfortable with those. I'm going to talk a little bit about what could go wrong, some of the things that I see that can cause us some grief in this area, and then we'll wrap up. Okay, sound good? Here we go. So what's natural capital? Well, capital in itself, to an economist, is some kind of an asset. We can think of equipment as capital, produced capital. We think about ourselves. We invest in ourselves as human capital. We can think about social capital, the fact that we're interacting with each other, we're building up trust, financial capital, and then there's natural capital, land, forests, ecosystems, watershed. These are all parts of capital. Capital stocks just like any other type of capital that we've got. We typically combine capital with other things. We put machinery together with labor, we produce things. Well, natural capital fits in that too. We can have natural capital that we can add some of our own human ingenuity to. We can produce things that people want. So natural capital generates ecosystem services. We can split those ecosystem services. We can put them in lots of different bins, but we can put them into market natural capital. So things that are already currently exchanged in a market, they have prices or values, energy reserves, minerals, timber stocks. We can value some of those through the market. But then there's this whole host of things that we have trouble valuing through the marketplace. Recreation. It's not priced like going to a movie theater. You don't pay an entrance fee typically for every recreation experience. Or if you do, it's administratively set. So it's not traded in a market. So what's the value of that? What's the value of improving it? Flood control. We don't usually pay for that. Water quality, water quantity. All these things that are things that we want, and things that natural capital provides, but we may not typically value them or price them in a market. What's an ecosystem service? A service provided by nature that people want. Pretty simple. What are payments for ecosystem services? Well, if there are certain things that we want, perhaps we could actually pay people to generate those. We do that in market natural capital or market services, timber. What about doing that for flood control or for provision of carbon, greenhouse gas emissions reductions, or water quality? We could design systems, and that's when I'm going to start talking about markets later on, to try to address this. Markets for ecosystem services, when some supplier, a landholder, a tenure holder, somebody that has access to that resource or asset, they are paid to provide something like an ecosystem service. You do it when you provide timber. Could you do it for providing water quality or improvements in water quantity? We'll talk about a couple examples of that. Sometimes these can be split into different categories. Again, private goods, a private good, a municipality may make an agreement with a landowner, and those two parties will get together and create an exchange to provide improvements in water quality. That's a service that's being sold by the landholder to the municipality. Municipality is interested in reducing their water treatment costs, so they make a deal. That's effectively a private good. Those two are benefiting from each other's and the transaction, just like somebody buying and selling a 2x4. You can also generate things that are public goods. Biodiversity benefits all of us. Greenhouse gas emissions reduction benefit all of us. So we could invest in ecosystem services and provide these public good benefits. And lastly, something that's going to come up a couple times is ecological or green infrastructure. This is just another way of describing natural capital. We can think about our capital stock as being infrastructure. We could choose to invest in that, for example, for flood control, instead of investing in cement and produced structures to try to reduce floods. So now we've got an investment decision that we can try to make. Okay, here's a couple of statements from the literature about ecosystem services that I like. Final ecosystem services are things that people enjoy, that people want them. Services are benefit specific, so we have to be careful not to kind of lump everything into one box. Water quality may play a role in drinking water. It may play a different role in improving fishing. Recreational fishing may improve in quality. Services are spatially explicit, so it matters where are those services produced, how close to people, what other types of interactions are they having. So when we think about the complexity of actually valuing ecosystem services, where they're created matters. And I like this one. Until there's some person who's benefiting from it, an ecological process is a process and not a service. Okay, this is the strict sort of economic definition or description of what we're thinking about when we're thinking about making investment decisions or measuring the value of natural capital. Okay, how do we understand these things? 3 different uses. I'm going to talk first about this notion of measuring sustainability, or really measuring the value of the assets. Everybody wants to know, for example, what their house is worth. How's my house doing? If I do some renovations, does my house value go up? I think I just did some. I'm hoping that at least doesn't erode the value of my house. Is my house depreciating? Why is it depreciating? Well, you could think about that for the country as a whole in terms of our capital stock, our produced capital, our human capital. You can think about that for natural capital. Are we investing in it? Are we letting it depreciate? For an economist, that's a measure of sustainability. If our value of our capital assets all added together increasing, that's a good thing. That means that our wealth is actually increasing. If they're depreciating, why are they depreciating? We need to struggle a little bit about that. So I'm going to spend some time on that. I'm going to talk a little bit about then, well, what if we turn this around and say, let's use this natural capital to help us make investment decisions. Should we reforest in a different way to try to improve water quality? Or think about a different forest management strategy to reduce floods? What investment decision would we make if we could measure the benefits of that compared to the costs of that? So I'm going to talk about some of those cases. And then lastly, I'm going to say, what if we turn those into markets? Now, I'm not suggesting that everything gets turned into a market. That is not a good idea. There are some cases where markets work really well. There are lots of cases where they don't work that well. But in some cases, even in the context of natural capital, I think markets can be quite helpful. They provide incentives, they stimulate technological development, so in a lot of cases, well, at least in some cases, they'll be useful. All right, so let me talk first about the sustainability issue. Statistics Canada, as it turns out, has probably the world's best group for measuring natural capital. And they try to incorporate that into other statistics to see how we're doing in terms of wealth, overall wealth. Last year, they published a report with IISD to try to give us the state of Canada's wealth, incorporating natural capital with all the other capital stocks. And let me just skip by that. Uh-oh. There we go. This is the outcome. That's one of the most boring graphs I've ever seen. No criticism of ISD and Stats Canada. This is fantastic work, and it's really detailed work. But what's going on? Well, the very top line on this is actually our aggregate wealth, natural capital mixed with produced capital and human capital, and you can see that it's rising, but not very quickly. In fact, over this time period, we have generally increased our wealth, but at a relatively slow rate of growth. So in a way, good news, bad news. At least we're not declining, but we're not appreciating very quickly, compared, especially when you look at this compared to other parts of the world. Now again, why is that happening? The green line, which I'm going to blow up on this next slide, is the natural capital stock. That's the value of the natural capital asset in the country as measured by Statistics Canada working with the IISD group. It's declining. Again, think about this in terms of your house. That means there's some depreciation going on. It means one of the components of sustainability is not increasing in wealth terms, it's declining in wealth terms. So to try to unpack that and say, why is that happening? Should I invest in something? Should I rethink what I'm doing with management strategies? I mean, the challenge with this in a way is that it's countrywide, is that it's all the different natural capital assets that they could put across the country. So we need to unpack this a little bit. But the other challenge is that this is only market natural capital. It doesn't measure any of those non-market pieces. So it's forests, minerals, energy, land. It doesn't include recreation or water quality or water quantity or any of those pieces. I think that's one of the challenges for us as researchers is can we start putting in some of these non-market measures into the capital statistics and then try to unpack why we're depreciating. A couple of other examples just quickly. One of my colleagues, Eli Fenichel, has been trying to take this same type of mechanism and bring it down to much smaller systems so you could do the same sustainability assessment at a regional scale. This was a study of his looking at the value of groundwater as natural capital in Kansas. And you can just read the quote up there. You can see Kansas experienced a non-trivial loss. The value of the aquifer fell at about 6.5% or $110 million a year. Again, think back to the value of your house. If you saw a 6.5% decline in the value of your house every year, you might start thinking, what should I be doing? Is that from forces outside my control? Is there something I should change with the way I'm managing? Should I reinvest in something? So these are the kinds of studies that I think can move us towards some actions around natural capital investments. This one hasn't been published yet. Fenichel and I and a couple other folks have done something. It's a little bit off the wall, but we actually tried to measure natural capital in boreal caribou stocks. It's a standing joke for me. When I started working on boreal caribou many years ago, I didn't have gray hair, and I'm sure it's working on boreal caribou that caused the gray hair. What do we find? We actually try to turn this around and say, well, again, we've got depreciation, and we can measure the value of, in this case, what we're calling the conservation debt. The conservation debt that's arising because of the depreciation of that particular capital asset. And again, maybe we can think about how we deal with it. All right, we've done that one. Let's move to the second one. Let's do an investment framework. Is it worth it? What kind of tools or skills do we need to assess whether it's worth it to make an investment? Investments are costly. And then we'll switch to markets. So what's valuable in a forest? I've already touched on this. We know about the market part, timber, et cetera, but all these other pieces, recreation, carbon management, water quantity, indigenous people's use of the land, It's a fascinating area we're just starting to work on. Habitat for wildlife, threatened species, biodiversity. These are all things that people want. How could we try to think about valuing these non-market pieces? Well, there's a list. If you really want to know how to do this, come take my course. It's going on right now. It runs from January until April. And that's basically what we do. We try to understand. We could measure the value of recreation because we can observe what people do. People spend money. We can understand how they value their recreation experiences based on time and money and energy that they put into those activities. We know a bit about carbon management. The federal government is thinking about investing directly into carbon management through planting trees. We have carbon offset markets. We have something called the social cost of carbon. So we can start unpacking these values. Water quantity and quality. We might measure that because there's reduced water treatment costs in a municipal water facility. We could take that value and say this is one representation of the value of improving water quality. Water quantity. We can measure that in terms of improved outputs. So a whole host of things that we could do. I'm going to run through a couple of, well, at least one quick example. And I think about this, I've tried to put this little list together of a simple investment framework. We're going to do this assessment. For example, should we invest in improving water quality? What do we need? We need to know who's going to buy it. Who are the people interested in that improvement in water quality? Are they willing to pay for it in some way? Could be through a government agency, it could be through individuals or a company buying on their own, but that's step one. That's the benefits of the service. We want to know the other side of it, the ecological production function. How are we actually going to create these benefits? Do we know the natural system well enough to say, if we do this, we will actually get those improvements in water quality? Or we'll avoid the deterioration in water quality? That's why in many of these studies, I work very closely with ecologists and foresters and hydrologists, because they're the ones that know the ecological production function. Who's going to sell it? A landowner? A tenure holder, somebody that's going to provide those services that'll get translated through the ecological production function to the buyers. Sometimes it could be the same entity. It could be a government that owns the tenure rights or owns the forest and also has the municipal treatment facility. We've seen that happen. We need some kind of a framework for this transaction to occur. Could be a contract, could be a market, could be an agreement, could be a government management plan. We've got buyers, sellers, ecology, framework. Last piece, we need to look at what else is produced. And that's the beauty of natural capital. I might be interested in improved water quality, and I do some things to get the improved water quality, but that might also generate investments or improvements in biodiversity or improvements in carbon management. And I want to know what those are, because those are additional benefits that I should count. But at the same time, I should keep track of what alternatives, what other ways could this improvement in water quality be achieved? Maybe I invest in my water treatment plant instead of investing in the forest system. Okay, quick example. Let's go to Panama. I know it's a weird place to go. You wouldn't think of it in a BC forest context, but because I did a research project there and I got to spend a bunch of time there, and because I experienced it, I think it's an interesting example. You may not know this, but the Panama Canal watershed, it's about 5% of the world's shipping traffic that goes through that canal watershed, goes through the canal. With the dry season, and especially with climate change, that sometimes they run short of water. They have to slow the ships down, they have to repackage what's on the ships. They lose money because they're not getting enough water into the canal system in the dry season. Now they could build a dam, big investment, gray infrastructure. They don't want to. Ecologically, it's challenging, it's expensive, politically, it's challenging. And so we said, well, could you plant trees? Could we actually plant trees to use a kind of sponge effect, so-called? Let me move on to that. Could you plant trees to essentially store water from the rainy season into the dry season? That's the ecology problem. And then if that actually maintains the water flow in the canal, that provides benefits to the canal authority. So if we go back to my framework, who's demanding this? The canal authority. They're going to make more money out of this deal. What's the ecological production function? These are the folks studying whether planting trees and different kinds of trees would actually result in more water being stored in the soil system so that it would be released more slowly, and would put water into the canal over that summer season, the dry season. Who are the suppliers? Well, we went to landholders. In fact, many of these landholders are quite poor in the watershed and said, rather than livestock, could we pay you to plant trees? Different kinds of trees in different ways, and tried to assess how much we would have to pay them to supply those watershed needs. And lastly, we look at co-benefits. This would provide carbon, it would provide some biodiversity, it would provide some sources of income to relatively poor landowners. So how'd we do? This is the slide of the ecological production function. I love that first one. Does anybody know what that top left thing is? That's a rainfall simulator. Because we were simulating to see whether the stuff actually stayed in the soil. They don't let me near that. They don't let the economists near that stuff. But it's very interesting to see how the ecological production function is actually created. That's part of the story. So what did we learn? Well, I told you you're going to get graphs. This is a supply and demand graph. That blue line is really what we'd have to pay the landowners to enroll acres of forest land to try to improve the hydrology of the system. And you can see that you get more acres, that's the bottom axis, or hectares, if you pay them more money. So we know what it costs. The horizontal lines are actually the revenue increases that the Canal Authority would get. We know what the benefits are. And so it actually does make sense to invest in forests in the Panama Canal system to improve the maintenance of the hydrology of the system to protect the Panama Canal watershed. But what else did we learn? It makes sense, but it's not going to be a massive program. We're not going to change the whole watershed into trees. The farmers wouldn't supply it. It's too expensive for them. It's an ecological infrastructure project, but we also have to worry about things like how long does it take for this to actually occur? Where exactly are we going to ask people to plant trees? And of course, we invested 4 years of work in figuring out the ecological production function. We may not have that amount of time and resources for many studies. So what could go wrong? Well, what if we don't know the value, the benefits, or the actual supply function? And from my perspective, that's information I need to know before I make this kind of investment. What if we don't know the ecological production function? We need to know the science. What if we're not actually providing additional services? In other words, we wanted to have more water in the canal. We didn't just want the status quo in the canal. A lot of uncertainty around these systems that can be a challenge. Uncertain link, we're paying for hectares, but we wanted water in the canal. We had to make sure we knew how that system worked. How are we going to do this? How are we going to actually pay the landowners? In our case, it was actually pretty straightforward. The Canal Authority is a big entity. They could pay the landowners for investing in trees, and they're actually doing pilots like this right now. Might not be feasible to do the whole thing at scale, either because the market itself physically is not big enough to supply all the services you want, or because the farmers, in our case, they didn't want to put their entire farms into forests. They still wanted a variety of different things that they grew, and so on. Other alternatives may be cheaper. Last topic, give me 2 minutes. What if we use markets? There are already markets for ecosystem services. This is a fascinating paper that came out in Nature Sustainability last year. Watershed programs dominate. $27 billion is in the US dollars in the global market for water services. If you can read the fine print, mostly in China. Payments for water services that are delivered by landowners to municipalities, to other entities, both water quantity and quality. And these are often direct transfers between the entity that wants the service. So we already have these kinds of markets. Not going to be feasible everywhere, but it's useful. The second largest one is, interestingly, biodiversity. These are often compliance markets. In other words, you're required to do something in order to access a particular resource. You're required to offset that impact with an investment in biodiversity improvement. Again, fairly large. Beneficiaries are not so clear. These are often governments that are paying or forcing the compliance market. And the third biggest one is forest and land use carbon, something that you're all speaking about and very familiar with. Again, investments to provide an ecosystem service that people want. Okay, let me wrap up. This is a little story of what we tried to do. We actually tried to create a little market in Alberta for wetland services. The city of Calgary was the demander. Remember those 4 steps. What's the demand? City of Calgary had a bunch of money that it collected from developers that it had to spend on wetlands. That's the demand. Ecological production function was easy because we had to go and find the drained wetlands and just fill them up. This little LiDAR image is actually, you can see the little drained wetland in there. Somebody had drained it a while ago, we could fill it up, we generate a wetland service. Who's the supplier? Landowners. So we as a research group actually walked the outskirts of Calgary and said, could we buy your wetland? And offered contracts to supply those ecosystem services. And we got some. It was a fascinating experience. In the question period, I can tell you a little bit about what we learned about how to establish an actual market like that from ground zero. It's really cool as a researcher to be on the ground, boots on the ground literally, to try to establish such a market. Worked in some ways, other ways it was a challenge. So I think in some context, we can establish these markets and they can provide these services. I'm going to leave with 2 things. I think this is an old quote, but I think one of the things we have to think about is what's going to happen in the future. Are these non-market values going to be increasingly important? And I think we've heard that time and time again, that people are more interested in carbon, recreation, wildlife management, biodiversity. If that's really where the services are going to go, we need to think about what are the benefits of them, what are the costs of supplying them, how can we set up the institutions to actually make them happen. All right, I'll leave with this last slide. There's lots of forms of natural capital. I think we can do the economic valuation in most cases, not in all cases. We can learn from that about how to measure sustainability. We can learn about how to make investments in natural capital. And in certain cases, we can turn those into markets and provide incentives for the provision of that natural capital. Apologies to my colleagues, I've gone a little bit over, but hopefully I've at least set a bit of the stage without nice pictures, and I'll pass it over to you. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Vic. Great coverage of the information and science background behind it. I think I speak for a lot of people here. It's great to have a 4-month course packed into 30 minutes. So that's a pretty good return on investment, I'd say. Just while we get onto our next slide package here, bear with us a moment, please. So I'm happy to introduce Emanuel Machado. Emanuel is the Chief Administrative Officer for the town of Gibsons, and he's also the chair of the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative, MNAI. It's on the web, you can Google that. Manny's led the development of the town of Gibsons' eco-asset strategy. This was the first of its kind in North America to formally recognize the role of nature as a fundamental component in the municipal infrastructure system. And it leads to a better understanding of the value of ecosystem services, improved financial and operational management plans of the community's natural assets. So welcome, Manny. And we'll pass it over to you. Okay, very good.
Good morning, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. So nature and the ecosystem services that it provides is a fundamental component of the town of Gibsons' infrastructure system. And the natural assets that provide those systems is also what we're relying upon to protect the community from the impacts of climate change as well. Many of the services that we deliver to our citizens are directly and indirectly delivered by nature. In Gibsons, we provide untreated water to our residents, and our aquifer stores and filters that water for us as well. Our creeks, our soils, and our forested areas combined provide the vast majority of the stormwater conveyance within our watershed. And our coastal assets, being a coastal community, our foreshore area protects the community and protects infrastructure and people as well. I'm speaking from the perspective of a local government, so we recognize that there are many other services that we get as well as a community, like pollination and habitat and so on. But we're tasked with providing water and sewer and stormwater conveyance to our residents, and that's our primary focus. In about 2014, the town of Gibsons became the first town in North America to declare nature its most valuable infrastructure asset. And council then directed staff to incorporate natural capital considerations into our operations, our investments, and our planning, including financial planning as well. And not necessarily having a guide that we could follow. What we've basically assembled is a revised practice that relies primarily on structured asset management. It relies on financial planning and also on ecology. Within the financial planning itself, the approach of ecological economics is very new to us, and we've been relying on the leadership of Michelle, and you'll hear why that is, to provide us with the information that we need. To some communities, this is just a ditch, but in Gibsons, this is a valuable natural asset that provides conveyance services very reliably at a very low cost. And we want to maintain it and make it last as long as possible. So what we call infrastructure is really a blend of natural and constructed assets. And they are interconnected and interdependent on each other to function adequately. Our asset management policy recognizes that we not only have fully engineered assets, but we also have a class of assets that are based on a biomimicry, such as green roofs and bioswales, that also provide valuable service. And we've got fully natural assets as well. We've moved away from simply having one department looking after one class of assets, and we use teams because it is obvious that these assets are more complex than we were managing before. In our policy, we describe a natural asset as a feature in the natural environment that provides a municipal-like service. It's part of our core business, so it's been a very good fit to incorporate natural assets into our structured asset program. We've been providing training to our staff, and we have some funding. No one has enough funding at the end of the day. But we also recognize that we're now managing ecosystems versus just individual assets. Ultimately, as we rely on these assets for service, we want to restore them to the highest integrity that they need to have, and we want to balance our extraction of service so that we're not inadvertently degrading the quality of the asset itself. Our goal ultimately is to have infrastructure that is the most natural, the most reliable, the most energy efficient, and that it costs the taxpayer the least over the long term. And to meet that goal, we have to manage our natural assets as well. And from a town of just under 5,000 people, we're doing this with our own forces, and obviously with support from others. But at the same time, from a cost perspective and risk and environmental benefit, it's been a very good fit for us. So how do we value the services that we get from nature? And how do we represent those values on our financial statements? On paper, the town is barely worth $50 million, but yet the value of the services that we get, such as water treatment, what our forests produce, and our foreshore, none of those services are valued on our statement sheet. From a financial planning perspective, natural assets have many advantages over engineered assets. There's no upfront cost, there's no depreciation, financial depreciation, there's no replacement cost. It's carbon neutral, it can even be carbon positive. It's certainly in terms of maintaining an aquifer in our stormwater system, it has relatively low costs of maintenance, and it could last in perpetuity as well. Not to mention the fact that this is a White Tower Park, and it's surrounded by residential areas, and most folks don't even necessarily realize that provides the bulk of the work for stormwater conveyance. We started the process of valuations very early on in 2016. We had a project to construct. Michelle is going to talk about that business case, but it's about council had to make a decision about bringing a new service to provide stormwater conveyance from a new neighborhood into the ocean. And that conveyance was going to cost us around $4.5 million. This area where this park sits was already providing a percentage of that service, and we wanted to know whether nature would do a better job, or what would that service look like. And so the study basically told us we could get as much service or even more for about 25 cents on the dollar. And so it was easy for council to make that decision, but it was also important for us to come with a document that they were able to put to have comfort to make that decision. Next, we want to value our remaining of our watershed, and also the coastal assets, which is a new valuation method that Michelle has developed as well. We use these valuations for capital decisions, for investing as well, for financial reporting, and to determine operation and maintenance cost as well. Not to mention to understand what our risk exposure is, which is important to keep in mind, and I'll talk about risk in a couple of minutes. Cities aren't permitted to report on the value of their services of the natural assets that they have. There's an accounting standard called 3150 that is what we're required to report on the depreciation of our engineered assets. And so we thought it was important for, at the risk of having sort of two sets of books, which in financing is not really a good thing, we submitted detailed recommendations to the Public Sector Accounting Board with a series of national organizations to permit just that, and so we're hoping to get some support from that. One of the first things that we did with that reduction in our projected costs was to reduce our development cost charges by 74%. And so certainly well received, and we tried to demonstrate that it is possible to invest in nature, get more service, and reduce your costs. And it is a definition of restorative development, which is one of the objectives of the United Nations as well. The federal government and the province, for that matter, have done a great job of readjusting their funding mechanisms to fully recognize investments. And we've also produced a guide for finance officers that tells the story about where some of these opportunities exist. From a risk perspective, I think the bigger question is, can we afford not to invest in these assets? Because if we're relying on these assets for service, what is the level of risk that we're prepared to accept? And for us, being in the water provision business, our level of risk has to be very, very low. So what we've done there was invest much more heavily on monitoring, both short and long-term monitoring, so we have some comfort that we can be aware of any possible changes. And also from a financial risk perspective, we don't have the money set aside to just go out and buy another aquifer or some form of replacement for that service. Not to mention also from a flooding perspective, the implications of business interruption or loss of life or property damage as well. So from a risk perspective, the Insurance Bureau of Canada have been very supportive of investments in green infrastructure. And their general rule of thumb is that we should keep the assets that we have, we should restore what we have lost, and we should build only what we must. And we certainly agree with that as well. We've changed our official community plan. We've changed our development process as well. We require some additional work around the protection of the aquifer. And we're updating our geotechnical hazards as well. This is all part of reducing risk for these assets. In terms of our urban forest planning work, we think there's substantial opportunity in the reforestation of our watershed. We've been undertaking inventories and condition assessments as well. In general, we want to make sure we have the right trees in the right place. And for us, those trees are the carbon storage, their slope stabilization, their rainwater conveyance, and so that's an important thing to keep in mind for us. We also amended our subdivision standards. Communities often have a disconnect between what they ask developers to build and their own ability to maintain those assets afterwards. And so it's cheaper to produce the same subdivision today in Gibsons than it was even 10 years ago, because we require a lot less infrastructure and we require investments in natural areas as an alternative, and we recognize that too. Even our emergency planning, we're working with our folks in terms of updating our responses to fires, wildfires in particular, and floods, and not to mention from a emergency social services perspective. From overall, what we're trying to figure out is that when we look at Gibsons, we all live in a bowl, and what we call infrastructure in general is we're referring primarily about a series of pipes at the bottom of the bowl. But in natural asset management, you're talking about managing the whole watershed and understanding the services. So we have an issue of scale, and we have an issue of governance. What we try to demonstrate here is that the town occupies a small percentage of that space, and yet a cubic meter of water from the top of Mount Elphinstone has to travel through 6 different regulatory environments. Some want it in a ditch or a pond or a culvert, and for us, we have to adjust our works to deal with that as well. Ultimately, our sustainability comes from when we jointly work through these agencies to restore and maintain the ecological integrity of the natural assets in these watersheds. And the town itself has been a living laboratory, and a lot of the work that we've been doing, we've created an organization that Michelle is part of, and it's called the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative, and we're going to share with you what we're doing with some national pilots. We have a research agenda and other work as well. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Manny. That's awesome. Fantastic. Great to see a real-life example in Gibsons. It's well done, and a credit to your group and yourselves' leadership. Well done. Our next speaker, Michelle Molnar. Michelle is the Technical Director of the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative, as well as an environmental economist and policy analyst at the David Suzuki Foundation. Her work focuses on the conservation of natural capital using various tools of ecological economics, policy analysis, and public outreach. She's the author of several natural capital valuations and sits on the BC government's Climate Solutions and Clean Growth Advisory Council. Michelle's an experienced project manager and practitioner of natural asset measurement and management. So, welcome to Nanaimo, Michelle. Thanks very much. We're glad to have you here.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. Thank you for the invitation to speak. And I think Manny and Vic have done a really great job kind of setting up this final talk of this session. So, as mentioned, I am the technical director of the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative. We work with local governments to really provide guidance in identifying, valuing, and accounting for their natural assets within their asset management processes and their financial planning. I bring a team with me, so I'm an economist, but I also work with ecologists, hydrologists, modelers to do this work. We're a fairly young organization, but we've worked with about 18 different communities across BC, Ontario, and New Brunswick. And I'm just going to highlight 5 examples of projects that we've done. I'll try to focus mainly on forests and let you know what we found and what some of our emerging lessons are. So just really quickly, thinking about our methodology, we do walk governments through the standard asset management questions, looking specifically at how we value those assets. However, it all starts from the science. So we complete ecological modeling that tells us what the capacity of a watershed, or a wetland or a forest is to provide stormwater services. Based upon that, we then work with the communities to say, okay, if you weren't getting the service, what would it cost you to replace it? What would it cost you to build that water treatment plant or that stormwater pond? And we use that as at least a minimum value of the services provided by that asset. So this is called a replacement cost approach, and we use it because it really fits in well for the decision-making that local governments are using. We do recognize that there's a wide variety of co-benefits that come with an ecosystem. We don't try to model all of them or put a price tag on all of them, but we do try to recognize them so that we don't have really narrowly focused decision-making. And we do complete scenario analysis with our model. So as I talk about each community, so many communities are really focused on stormwater management, but the context is different from community to community. So we ask, how does that asset change with changes in demand? Whether that's increasing development pressures or climate change is one that, not surprisingly, many communities are interested in. So our work started in Gibsons with White Tower Park. Manny explained the context. They recognize that White Tower Park, which is about 4 square kilometers, a fairly small park in the center of town, is conveying their stormwater. They had a development upstream, and as he mentioned, they were asking, can this park currently handle the flows coming from that development? Or do we need to build a bypass pipe? Or is there restoration work we could do to improve the capacity of White Tower Park? So we completed modeling. We found that that park is indeed capable of handling those flows. And we valued it at the cost of that bypass pipe, which is about $4 million. We let them know what the annual operating and maintenance costs are. But perhaps more interestingly is if they did some restoration, if they built a settling pond and connected some of those ponds, it actually would be much more effective than the bypass pipe at reducing peak flows in the area. The other really interesting thing to come out of this work was the management arrangement they have for this park. So the town does not own White Tower Park. It's actually owned by the regional district, but they have an agreement to manage it. So in addition to being managed for recreation, they're now managing it also for stormwater management. The next example is the region of Peel. Much bigger area in the Greater Toronto Area, population of 1.3 million. A lot of data. The Conservation Authority in this area has been collecting data for quite a long time, and we worked quite closely with them to look at this large watershed and the role of multiple assets within it. What did we find? We found that the forests in that watershed are indeed handling the 1 in 100-year storm event. They are capable of treating water to the provincial water quality regulations. And when we completed scenario analysis, we found the value of those assets increase over time. So if they had to currently replace those services with the current conditions, it would cost them about $240 million. But when we look at local climate change projections, that value is going to rise to almost $270 million by 2060. Riverside, Alberta is a very small community, 350 people in New Brunswick, fairly close to the Bay of Fundy. Those people rely upon a watershed for their drinking water. And they're looking to the future, and there's 2 key things that they're worried about. One is a significant increase in tourism. So there's a highway that's will be connecting the Bay of Fundy Park to Moncton. It's going to go right past Riverside, Alberta. It's this beautiful small little town. People are going to want to stop and enjoy the services of that town. So they know that there's going to be an increase in demand. They're also looking towards climate change. They've experienced changes in their weather, and looking ahead, they know the past is not going to necessarily predict the future. So we looked at what is the value of water supply for that watershed, and we looked at two alternatives for them. They said, okay, we could build a groundwater system, dig a few wells. That's going to cost a little less than $1 million to do that. Their other option is actually trucking in drinking water, and that's going to be about $1 million every year. So that gave them an idea of next steps for them. They're looking at engaging in watershed management planning, and in the meantime, at least, increasing their storage capacity, because 100 tourists during the summer peak season will actually exceed their water supply abilities right now. Florenceville, Bristol, another town. They've been dealing with some significant flooding. Just before we started this project, they had what was close to a 1 in 1,000 year storm event. So just phenomenal flooding. And they're asking, how do our forests, our upstream forests, actually reduce pressure on our gray infrastructure? Because we're seeing culverts that are continually blown that we have to just keep building bigger and bigger, and then ultimately bridges over these areas. So they also have a lot of pressure to convert forests to agriculture. McCain is a really big employer in this region. So we asked just that. We said, if you convert some of these upstream forests to agriculture, what is the impact going to be on the gray infrastructure in your town? And we found that value is currently $3.5 million. And then when we did climate projections, that's going to increase to just over $4 million. And lastly, I'll just touch upon this project, the Comox Lake watershed here on the island. We're working with that community to really understand the value of drinking water. So over 40,000 people rely upon that drinking water. It's a multi-use watershed with multiple owners. 2/3 of it is owned by forestry companies. And really trying to understand what that value is. Is it possible to reduce water treatment costs through management of those forests? And really this is a project that has really focused and raised an issue and a question that we've been tackling is, how do you work with different landowners to manage a watershed? So as I mentioned, we do consider a large range of co-benefits. Forests come with a bundle of them, and these are some of the ones that we've looked at. As I said, we haven't valued them, but we've certainly done a bit of work on really just understanding the role they play in communities. And I'll close with some lessons that we've learned over time. So we find under both intensification of development scenarios and climate change that, generally speaking, the value of natural assets will increase. They're much more adaptable and resilient to changing conditions than engineered infrastructure. We find intact upstream forests play a very important role in providing stormwater services, providing that flood protection, providing that erosion control. And we find that in order to maintain these natural assets, local governments need to look at a range of tools that they have. There might be some regulatory options, as well as incentives, payments for ecosystem services, and working with private landowners to address the services that they're providing and those that are being received by residents in the area. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. We'll move over to Pigeonhole here now. No, that's not it.
Should have been the Chrome icon.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's try it. Try it again.
If you have an opportunity, please vote for questions. Please add questions. I saw that there was a bit of a sign-in process for this one. I don't know if that's changed for us, but it was new for me this time. So, anyways. We're lucky. We're lucky. It's just us. Special. Okay, I'll pass the mic over to the group, and I'll read from the lectern. So our first question, have ecosystem services been used to quantify the value of conserving forests rather than harvesting? How do you think this could be applied to forests in the urban interface?
Yeah, go ahead. I think the answer is yes. I think actually Michelle's given you a couple of examples of exactly that. What happens with the forest versus without the forest? What services are provided? What are they worth with the forest versus without the forest? I know we've been engaged in a number of different settings where the forest actually could improve property values versus without a forest in the surrounding area. So it's a question of the trade-off of, do we build more houses or do we increase the value of the properties of that surrounding area? But you can measure those things, and it's going to be dependent on the context. You'll change the hydrology services, you'll change the recreation services. That's what gets put into that value with the forest versus without the forest.
Yeah, nothing to add there. I agree.
Great. We'll go to the next question, please. With climate change and migrating ecosystems, for example, flying back zones, how do we quantify ecosystem assets through their transition with climate change? Bit of a packed question there.
Yeah, it's complex. Ecology is complex. We make assumptions in our models, and models are not perfect. We generally only look out so far to 2050, maybe 2060. And of course, we're assuming that the forest is going to remain. Essentially, the structure of it is going to be the same structure in 2050 or 2060, and provide that same range of services. The key question is, what happens if certain species, migrate? And of course, these are systems. So a really interesting question, and one that I think modelers are grappling with and trying to represent. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so for a real example for us is that White Tower Park that we're actually expanding a little bit more. We're not certainly assuming that once it's the ponds are installed that we can just walk away and will last forever. We expect to regularly have to dredge some of those ponds. I think the soil would need some replacement, or parts of it anyway, and some of those trees will be replaced. But compared to the pipe option, certainly we could have almost booked the day that we're going to have to come up with the same amount of money again. And so we don't see that with the forest, and we should be planning to continuously reinvest into it.
Maybe just to throw one other angle onto this. In a sense, climate change is yet another thing to model of things that are just going to change over time. So for example, we're doing a project at the City of Calgary to see whether forest management can reduce the cost of treating drinking water. Well, the population growth in the City of Calgary is one of the elements in that. The city grows, you're going to need more water, you're going to need more water treatment capability, but we're projecting what that population will be. We might be better at that than projecting the climate change conditions, but in both cases, we've got to take guesses at what's going to happen in the future so we can evaluate these values through the time period that we're thinking the project will last. So it's already there, but the climate change ones, especially at local levels, is really tough.
Thank you. Next question. And it's nice to see the culmination of a lot of our talk over the last 2 days. Do you, and maybe I'll add, how do you consult with First Nations when evaluating a forest's worth? And how does this affect the evaluation?
It's a really good question. We are starting to do this with the Comox Valley watershed, where the Comox First Nations are really important stakeholder, well, beyond governance in that watershed. So we've started talking with them. I think that I can't tell you what the outcome is and what we've decided upon yet, but they generally don't have as reductionist a view as you know, many of the local governments that we work in. So it's really trying to understand how we need to adjust our method to recognize different viewpoints, and it's a work in progress, and happy to hear about other.
I think this is a really interesting question, and I'm glad people are working on it. I could have brought another slide deck. I gave a presentation on exactly this topic 3 days ago, working on a project with Environment Canada and the Species at Risk Act. And part of the Species at Risk Act requires a kind of cost-benefit analysis. But if the changes affect Indigenous people, how are those valued and brought into a benefit-cost analysis? So we are working with a group that engages Indigenous people. We're planning to meet with them. You're absolutely right. It's a different view of the linkage between the ecosystem and the people. There is no ecology and economics. They're all mixed together. So it's a different concept of how the systems work and how the institutions work. And I had an experience about 15 years ago working with Mystic Management in northern Saskatchewan that was in part owned by the Indigenous people in the community. And it was a fascinating experience to work with the community to understand their values for forest management and to understand how that input would be used in forestry and forestry management decisions. And it is a very different environment to work in, but I think really beneficial. It takes time, takes energy, takes people on the ground, but I think it really added value to the way the forest management was done and how the investment analysis, if you like, was done in the context of an Indigenous perspective.
Thank you. So, Vic, can you provide an example of calculating the economic value of recreational services in viewscapes?
Sure. I mean, the economic value of recreation, we're usually getting information on what people actually do. Where do they go? How much time do they spend? And so we can use that information on how they're spending money. That tells us how they value that particular place or the characteristics of that place. And we can turn that around and say, well, if we improve the services there, they would go more often, or more people would go, and we can start to measure the economic value of that recreational outcome. We're actually looking at this from the other perspective right now in Alberta. We have an issue with something called chronic wasting disease. That's a prion disease in deer and elk, potentially in caribou. And that could be having adverse effects on recreational hunting. So we're measuring the potential loss associated with recreational hunting values if we don't do something to try to slow down or reduce the prevalence of chronic wasting disease. So we've got a number of techniques on that side that'll try to measure those based on what people currently do. The view side, again, one common technique is property valuation. People with very nice views will pay more money for those views. You can invest in the surroundings of a neighborhood and you'll see the asset values rise. Whether it's viewscapes or water quality or various other types of services, we can back that out of what people are willing to pay for rents or for property values. And again, those studies have been done. They can be applied to various cases in a particular regional context. That's just two examples of the approaches.
That's a great question, friend Jessica. Thank you very much. It really brings some meat to the topic. From Denise, are you aware of any calculations, research valuing natural capital by incorporating the cumulative effects of all of these things as they come together?
So our models can look at, layering in a range of impacts. So it can look at, changing the land base to incorporate, increased development, to incorporate climate change, to incorporate, an increase in engineered infrastructure, and potentially, with more and more sophisticated models. With our work, we really try to hit that sweet spot of computational rigor with our models, but also ease of use, so that communities can carry on doing this work after we step away. But depending upon, really the effort and resources that you want to put into modeling this, there are increasingly sophisticated models to layer on a range of impacts.
Super, thank you. How do we minimize the effort and time required to provide valuation for the host of ecosystem values? The research path seems tedious when we need to reconcile values now. So it's a great question. Thank you, Casey.
You're asking the wrong person. I'm a researcher. I love doing these things. But I mean, it keeps me busy, it keeps me employed. I can see it. I mean, I think, again, going back to some of the benefit cost analyses that my colleagues in the federal government are required to do, they have to do them in 4 months. They can't go out and collect primary data and do all the fun things that I like to do. They have to get this thing done, and a decision has to be made. So what's happening in that context? I think there's a fair amount of interest in to what extent could we learn from other places that are similar, and what do we have to do to take those kinds of measures of the benefits of investment in natural capital from a similar jurisdiction and move it to the place that we're interested in. It's not going to be perfect, but it's going to help us move along that front. We can also use various kinds of principles to see, can we adapt those kind of values. I mean, I personally think if we started a more systematic assessment of where we are, where we should invest in some research that would really inform a number of different policy outcomes, a number of different policy questions like stormwater management, then we could start building up a database that would help us really address these questions in a shorter period of time. But I mean, I hear you in terms of the challenge of trying to do this. You don't have 4 years and 2 PhD students before you can reach your decision. You've got to reach a decision in a few months, and we've got to find a way to bridge that gap.
For the town of Gibsons, what that would mean, what we've been thinking about is to take the lessons from White Tower Park and expand that throughout the whole watershed. So we would want to, we've identified that, but protect the recharge area of the aquifer. We've got 3 major creeks that we need restoration. We've got another 2 additional parks that need probably some reforestation there. And our foreshore, particularly the portion that faces the strait, needs a lot of rebuilding, including well into the marine environment. So we're curious about, we're working with Michelle that within the next 18 months to 2 years, we'll have a lot of information about what type of investment are we talking about to make the Gibsons watershed as resilient as possible to the impacts of climate change. And insurance corporations have been talking about this resiliency coverage in some ways. There are concerns in communities that they might not be able to get insurance if they don't sort of adapt those areas to make it more livable and resistant to live as well. So.
Thank you. We have about a minute left, maybe a little bit less than that, so I'll ask an easy question here, and I'm going to pull rank, sorry. It kind of goes to the idea of what gets measured gets done. And Manny, this is specifically, I think, for you with what you've done in Gibsons. And you spoke to a little bit of one of the challenges, accounting standards. How do we help those things get changed so that we can put it on the balance sheet, we can physically and quantitatively account for it, so forest managers, finance folks that are managing forest land bases can realistically account for these really important things beyond just the fiber?
So for us, our first conversations were primarily about barriers to reporting. And after about a couple of years, we realized that our bigger concern is we actually don't have a lot of barriers in investing in from a financial planning perspective of the community. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. Accounting standards, right. So that to me, I see that the accounting standards matter sort of as a short-term issue. I think in the end, for our taxpayers, I think the most important piece for us is understanding the risk. You know, there are a new standard that came out a couple of years ago. There's another one this year that communities have to report on any possible liabilities from contaminated sites or other types of future obligations. And for us, the question is, what if we lose these assets? Shouldn't we be reporting on those liabilities or those potential risks at least? I think that's very important, and we would want to know that and prepare ourselves for that. Strictly on the ground for a day-to-day decision making in a small town, we want more information so we can go to council with better information so they can, you know, make, quite frankly, better decisions. And up until we came up with a business case for nature, the best that we had was to say, you know, nature is good and we should protect it. And of course, we have communities, you know, like ours are no different. There's still a great divide between conservation and growth and development. And we don't think that those are the only two options. And we're trying to demonstrate that it is possible to, you know, we approved over 700 units of housing in Gibson in the last couple of years. We have 200 new businesses that came in the last year. There was 180 the year before that. So we're growing. But we've also been able to conserve 50% of our consumption in terms of water, so we're able to service more people with the same asset. And that only is possible through our management system. So those are some of the questions we're dealing with.
Thank you. Thank you to all of our speakers, Vic Adamowicz, Michelle Molnar, Manny. Really appreciate your time here. Thank you. On behalf of the organizing committee, we have a small gift. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks, man. Thanks. Thank you all for joining us. Just a reminder, the inductees luncheon at noon today. Bit of a coffee break. There's a resolution session as well. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you very much.
Pardon?